Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Prim's Thought Space. I am Primrose Jikombarero Joylin Bima, and I create content about research, career development, and wellness. Today's video is dedicated to postdoc reflections, as I will be reflecting on the years that I spent at the University of Cape Town, as well as Stellenbosch University as a postdoctoral research fellow. So, for the purposes of this discussion, I will give my own broad definition of what a postdoc is, and then, of course, go in depth into discussing the two different experiences that I had, and also sharing insights that I gained from engaging with other postdoctoral research fellows. Now, you might be wondering before we go any further what I think about postdocs in general. Should you pursue one after your PhD? Or is it a step that might be, in the wrong direction? I don't think that there is one correct answer to this. I do think that if you have the opportunity to apply for a postdoctoral research fellowship and you actually interview for the role and get it, it is worth pursuing, particularly if you are an international student, right? So let's say you are at a university in another country, you're finishing off your PhD, you still want to do research in that particular context, continue looking for jobs in that particular context, then pursuing a postdoctoral research fellowship is actually a good step to take. This also applies, for example, let's say you did your studies in another country, but you want to get into academia in a different country context, right? I do think that you're more likely to get in as a postdoctoral research fellow as opposed to going in wanting to work there because maybe they prioritize taking people that are familiar with their particular educational systems. So I do think that it is a step in the right direction, particularly if you are pursuing one outside your home country. Obviously, this is also biased because I do not have the experience of pursuing a postdoc in my own country of origin, which is Zimbabwe. I studied in South Africa from undergrad through to PhD, and my postdoctoral research fellowships were within the South African context, both of which were in the same province, which is the Western Cape province of South Africa. All right, so a postdoc is a research position within a university, an academic institution, basically. And you work with what we usually call a principal investigator. So, this is just a fancy term for the person who will be supervising you at this level. And oftentimes, I think without fail, someone who supervises a postdoc should be a professor because you are a doctor, right? So why should a doctor be supervising you? But of course, there are exceptions to the rule, and I'm speaking about this from personal experience as well. So you have earned your PhD, is the ideal standard. But there are also postdocs that are advertised on the basis that you have submitted your thesis for marking. And that was my experience with the University of Cape Town, for example. I submitted my thesis by March of February 2021, and as of April, I was a postdoc because one of the conditions was that you should have just submitted your PhD. And then, of course, the conditions for my postdoc then became you need to write papers and other publications based on your PhD because I was still very close to my PhD experience. Okay, I'm already going far. In terms of how long a postdoc is, it could be anything between, I think, 6 months and 5 years. I've seen some people doing up to 10 years at the same institution. So I do think that there is no set rule. I think it depends on the institution, the provisions and guidelines they have, the supervision you are under, the availability of funds, and any other factors that I might not have mentioned because I'm not aware of them yet. So, the aim of a postdoc, right? On paper, it is apparently to pave way for someone to become an academic. I think that postdoc positions became more popular because of institutions having more PhD graduates than ever before, therefore, not being able to consume everyone into their workforce as a full time or rather permanent academic. So they're like, but we can't do away with the skills. Let's create research roles for these people, hence the term a research fellow. It is mainly research oriented. All right. So I think I've covered the basics of what a postdoc is. You need to have finished your PhD thesis. And yeah, let's get into the South African context. So, foremost in South Africa, postdoctoral research fellowships are untaxed, which means that the amount that is stipulated when they advertise for the role or when you get an offer is the amount you will get, the total sum. How you earn this money is often dependent on the institution. I remember with the University of Cape Town, I received my money in tranches, I think in three tranches. And then when I was at Stellenbosch University, the money came monthly. And of course, like I said, it was not taxed. So you can actually pre budget because you know how much you're expecting and there's not going to be any deductions. Why are they not taxed? I am not privy as to why. I've never done my research, but I also think that to a large extent, postdocs don't earn a lot of money. Most of them earn, from a third to about half of what full-time academics earn. And there's also no benefits. You don't have medical aid, you don't have any employee benefits. You're actually not even an employee. So I think it being untaxed is quite helpful to a large extent. Now, I've already mentioned that a postdoctoral research fellowship is research oriented. Sometimes you may be given the opportunity to supervise students, particularly honors and master's candidates. Sometimes you can be given the opportunity to teach within the institution, but those two, of course, are not guaranteed. Oftentimes, if it's stipulated as one of your requirements for your postdoctoral research fellowship, otherwise, if not, then they do not have an obligation to give you teaching positions or supervision roles. So, in terms of funding, the money usually comes out of a research pool. For example, with the University of Cape Town, the University Research Council, URC, and I also was a recipient of a National Research Foundation sponsored postdoctoral research fellowship, which is also, I think, one of the biggest funders of postdocs in South Africa. And then they are usually based on thematic areas. So when they call for postdoc applications, they stipulate the research topics or research areas they want you to focus on. Sometimes these might be linked to your PhD, and sometimes they won't be. I think for me, I held roles in these different categories. So for my PhD in political studies, my focus was on electoral conflict and mediation processes responding to that. And to a large extent, my postdoc experience at the University of Cape Town looked at that. But I also ended up doing research on the role of the African Union in maintaining peace and economic development on the African continent. As for Stellenbosch University, it was a gender justice oriented postdoctoral research fellowship, and I managed to apply for it based on my experience teaching in gender studies, despite not having a PhD in gender. And oftentimes they actually indicate you just have to have a PhD in the social sciences or sometimes what they call a cognate field. So, having experience conducting research and teaching in gender, I still qualified. And then in terms of outputs, usually they want you to publish a book. I'm not sure about more than one book, book chapters, journal articles, working papers, to participate in workshops, conferences, seminars, and webinars. Now, let's look at Dr. Prim's experiences. So, my first postdoc, like I said earlier, I started after submitting my PhD thesis. And the requirement was for me to write working papers based on my thesis topic. So, I focused a lot looking at electoral conflicts that had occurred in Southern Africa broadly, even though my PhD was on Lesotho and Zimbabwe specifically. So, I ended up getting research insights from Malawi, gaining research insights also from the DRC, for example, and conducting comparative studies. So I was expanding on my knowledge and also adding insights based on my study on SADC's peacemaking efforts in Lesotho and Zimbabwe. And then that was for 1 year. In the second year, I ended up conducting research mainly on the African Union's role in promoting continental development, the African Union's role in promoting peace and security on the continent, and these were mainly informed by my main supervisor's research interests. So for the first one, where I was mainly focusing on electoral conflict and peacemaking approaches in terms of diplomacy in the SADC region, I was sponsored by the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship, and Public Policy, right? And then I was sponsored by the University Research Council when I was now doing the second year. And my supervisor was quite flexible, hence the change in my focus area. It was also a breath of fresh air to research in a new area because I think that my research was quite niche. You're focusing on Southern Africa, you're focusing on a few countries. When you're looking at the work of the African Union, it is more broad and you're expanding, your intellectual focus. And I think for me that was important. I also even conducted research on European Union and African Union relations. So that was really beneficial, I believe, getting paid whilst expanding my research focus. And then moving to Stellenbosch, to be quite honest, I knew that my University of Cape Town postdoc was coming to an end. I was just applying for postdocs in any other area that matched my research as well as teaching skills. And that's how I landed this particular National Research Foundation NRF funded postdoc. And important to note was that this postdoc was advertised by an academic who had been given funds by NRF. So I personally do not know how to apply through the NRF straight because I applied under a program that was already funded by the NRF. And Stellenbosch University also supplemented the figure because I think it was just too low. So they added on to those funds. So the university also supported me to some extent. And my focus was on gender justice and inclusion. Initially was supposed to be in the schooling system, so primary and high schools, but because the ethical clearance would have taken longer to obtain, I had to focus on institutions of higher learning. And of course, Stellenbosch University became the main area of focus. I also ended up doing research on other universities in the Western Cape, which were within reach. This included the University of Cape Town, the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and of course, the University of the Western Cape. All right, so my aim today is not to delve into the subjects that I was looking at in terms of my research. So, just comparing the two experiences. The University of Cape Town, I think I had a lot of pressure. They paid more, right? More than any other opportunity I think I got within the first 4 years after graduating with my PhD. But the requirement to write a new working paper every month, I think to a large extent, was just not ideal. I don't want to say it was unrealistic, but I felt it. I think I struggled more because I came straight from PhD into the postdoc. So I actually never took a break. And I think that took a toll on me as well. So you might as well want to consider taking a breather after your PhD. But you know what? I have had financial struggles and I was not about to gamble with my life like that. But also, maybe I was gambling with my mental and academic health to some extent. So I worked a lot. I was always researching on new topics. And with the Stellenbosch University one, I just had to write, I think, at least two journal articles for the year and then participate in different spaces, seminars, conferences, and whatnot, also presenting on like the same topics. And I think with the Stellenbosch University one, they were sort of like lenient in the sense that my proposal for my research project was considered to be a deliverable. Unlike with the University of Cape Town, your research outputs, the ultimate ones, the papers, were what they counted as key outputs. But I think one thing that stressed me on the Stellenbosch University side was that any paper you wanted to write, you had to apply for ethical clearance using a proposal in the same way that you literally write a proposal for, like, let's say your honors or your master's or your PhD. And for me, that was taxing. And if you're going to give someone a 2 year postdoc and they have to do that for everything they want to write, then that limits, of course, their outputs, which is why I think they landed at, the requirement for just two research outputs, for example, in the format of journal articles per year. All right. And then when it came to the requirements for what you had to publish, I think that publishing solo was something I struggled to do. So for my first postdoc, I wrote with my supervisor. who had been my master's supervisor and then my PhD supervisor. And there were also other people within the institute where I was located that wanted to write with me. I wrote papers with them as well. I do think that that was necessary because I did my master's alone, I did my PhD alone. Also reflected on this in my previous video about how I was alone academically as well as emotionally. So I think that the opportunity to collaborate was more than welcome. And it is, I think, a skill that one requires before moving into different workspaces, whether within academia or elsewhere. And then Stellenbosch University also collaborated with my postdoc supervisor in terms of writing and research. And I think that was important for me. I do want to admit that, towards the end of both postdocs, end of my UCT postdoc, end of my Stellenbosch University postdoc, I ended up having solo authored book chapters and solo authored journal articles. So I still managed to gain the research independence required for the outputs for both postdoctoral research fellowships, right? And then in terms of participating in webinars and seminars, oftentimes these were weekly at both universities. So attendance in terms of attending, watching or listening rather to other people's presentations and giving them feedback, presenting my own papers during, designated seminars as well, and getting feedback on that. And I think that also helped in terms of research collaboration for me to improve on the papers that I was working on ahead of conferences, on the papers I was working on ahead of submitting them for review and whatnot. So if you really need peer support, I do think that a postdoctoral research fellowship can give you that. For me, a postdoc filled in the gap for what I lost out on for my PhD because, for example, during my PhD, it was hard lockdown, COVID, and I was not exposed to people who were also in the PhD trenches. But when I was doing my postdoc, I was also exposed to other postdocs, and I was also exposed to the work of other academics, both, post PhD and also those who were still doing their masters as well as their PhDs. And then when it comes to outputs, in terms of book chapters, I think I did a lot more of that more than journal articles. And I think I only found out later on that journal articles have more weight compared to book chapters in terms of the peer review processes they go through. Apparently, journal articles go through more, rigorous review processes. So I responded to calls for book chapters and wrote beautiful book chapters, but I didn't know that the weight that they carried in terms of points was less. I don't know off by head, what each one carries in terms of the point load, but I can let you know, like, ASAP before you enter your postdoc, you need to do your research and see what they prioritize. So usually books carry a lot more weight than any form of publication, followed by your journal articles, and I think then followed by book chapters. And then there's what we call review articles. Like, let's say you're reviewing a book. I had one such article and I didn't know also that it was lowly ranked because I thought, oh, well, it's in a journal, it's a journal article. So there's a lot that I had to learn before my postdoc that I never got to learn. And I do think that before you enter a postdoc, do your research in terms of what are the outputs required of me and what is the point scale for each. Of course, this may not matter if they've clearly stated to say we want 12 working papers, for example. You're going to work more on that than anything else. If they're going to say they want 2 journal articles, you're going to work more on that and, less of anything else. However, you are doing so to satisfy the funder, but you're supposed to be building your own career. So if you want to be an academic, once you leave after your postdoc, you need to actually have those book chapters, have a book maybe, and have journal articles. So neglecting writing for outputs that weigh more because you're focusing a lot more on what is required by the institution, if it's not journal articles or a book, might hurt your chances of getting a role in academia in the foreseeable future. So, like short to medium term. So, you still need to aim to write those. I didn't want to write a book because my PhD topic traumatized me to an extent where I don't want to write a book on it to date. And then, journal articles, the review processes are usually quite long, and there's never a guarantee of them being accepted. So, what I appreciated was that you just needed to prove that you'd submitted journal articles for review instead of proving that you submitted and they were published. Because, trust me, in academia, 2 years sometimes is not enough for you to write journal articles and have them all approved and published. All right. So, one thing I also liked about being situated in a university was that the university will use their pool of funds to pay for your submissions. This applied to the University of Cape Town as well as to Stellenbosch University. I do think that this should be the case for other universities, but of course, I stand to be corrected. So you don't need to be paying 6,000 rands to submit a journal article if it's required. For example, you apply through the research funds that you have or through extra research funds coming maybe from your host department or the host institution itself. So I think for me that really helped because I didn't have money after PhD and I was not going to be in a position to be able to raise funds just to submit papers. That was not possible in my case. And then what I liked was that in many ways the postdocs were preparation for the future. As someone who loves research, as someone who loves to collaborate, as someone who is always keen to learn about new research areas, I got that opportunity through the postdocs while getting paid. And then I think one major challenge of postdocs is precarity. There's always a high level of uncertainty of what is going to happen afterwards. You're in a situation of what we may call waithood, where you're waiting, but you don't even know if what you're waiting for is going to come, particularly if you want to end up being an academic. So it's a very risky endeavor in the sense that you've been in academia for so long. For example, in my case, 2012 through to 2021, I was mostly in academia. And then you enter a postdoc also 2022 to 2024. 4 years. That's like another PhD for someone. So I think that whilst you're pursuing one, you need to be very calculative by trying to get experience outside academia as well, and by applying for jobs not only within academia but outside as well. Take it as a time buying opportunity and then ensure that while buying the time, you're earning and also investing in earning new skills. So I think for me, for example, I ended up doing courses in project management. I did a course in copy editing. And towards the end, for example, I ended up doing a course on digital marketing, which helped me to pivot out of academia into a digital marketing role outside academia, but still within political consulting. So make sure that you are also, expanding what you already know in terms of knowledge areas and publications, but also your skill set. Because there's never a point of arrival. In my home language, Shona, we say kudzidza hakuperi, which means learning never ends. All right. So I think let's go to the source of income. Honestly, I don't think postdocs are well paid. Oftentimes, the amount is enough to cater for your accommodation and day to day expenses. And when it comes to the earnings, it doesn't matter which faculty you belong to. Let's say it's a 300,000 Rand postdoc. It's not going to be based on, oh no, this one needs to do field work by going to different countries and conducting interviews or by spending time in different villages, collecting data on how they live, or this one needs to do experiments using chemicals. I don't even know why, most of the funds are uniform. So oftentimes you have to find out if you can get more funds from your department or the university itself. Otherwise, you have to work within the available funds. And then I also think that living in the Western Cape, Stellenbosch is expensive, Cape Town is expensive. So I always needed to gain extra income for me to be comfortable, for me to be able to save, and also for me to be able to invest in my future. Otherwise, the postdoc income on its own was not sufficient. I have seen though, like some people will say, I don't know, I did my postdoc, even ended up buying a car. And I'm like, okay, interesting times. So I think things work differently for different people. What really helps is by trying to make sure that you get the opportunity to teach as well as supervise. I got to supervise when I was doing my Stellenbosch University postdoc, but of course, I didn't get any extra remuneration for it. But it gave me work experience that I could account for when I then applied for my current role as a lecturer at Africa University in Zimbabwe. So try not to leave your postdoc without having any supervision experience, even if it is at least at honors level. One major challenge is, of course, your postdoc is usually short, 1 to 2 years, for example. So what that means is you might not be able to be with certain students to the point of completion, particularly the master's ones. So a postdoc is already constraining in that regard. And then when it comes to lecturing, oh my goodness, the University of Cape Town, I will forever be grateful because I got to teach a wide range of courses in gender and development, theories, politics and action, global governance, transnational feminisms at master's level, teaching about the politics of gendered knowledge at both undergrad as well as honors level, teaching on feminist research methods at honors level. So I learned a lot because I got the opportunity to teach while I was there. However, one of the downsides is obviously the reality that you can't work a lot more hours beyond your postdoc because remember your main research outputs are research based. So I think in South Africa the current requirement is that you can work 12 hours per week in terms of extra work, and of course the extra work you then do is a text. So whenever I was a guest lecturer or replacement lecturer for a course, I was getting text for the income for those particular roles. That notwithstanding, I was armed with a whole set of new skills in lecturing and becoming a course convener, in becoming a member of a department, as well as in managing teaching assistants, managing tutors, and also skills gained in terms of just interacting with administrative staff at a university level. I don't know if I've left anything else at this stage. I want to say that doing a postdoc can be a very painful situation. So you're not a student and you're not an employee and you are very temporary. You're sitting on a maybe 8 month contract or a 1 or 2 year contract. Sometimes it might have to come to an end abruptly, right? For example, when I was doing my postdoc at Stellenbosch University, in my first year, my principal investigator got a job elsewhere in the world and he had to leave. And one of the requirements was that they were supposed to drop all commitments they had in terms of supervision. And so they also had to drop me. Fortunately, the department stepped in and I got an alternative supervisor so that at least they could, live up to the commitment that my supervisor had made to supervise me for 2 years. While at the University of Cape Town, also, my principal investigator was nearing retirement. So by the time I finished the second year of my postdoc, he was done. Like he was ready for retirement. So I think that affected me to a large extent, particularly when it came to the support that they could give while in transition, whether into retirement or into new roles abroad. So I was left alone for a significant amount of time. And I think those alone moments led to the sole authored chapters as well, sole authored journal articles, which of course I am grateful for. And then one challenge I experienced was not having postdocs who were researching on the same topics. I'm always doing something unique and different from others. So, in the same way, I didn't have PhD struggle buddies, I didn't even have postdoc struggle buddies. Yes, we could relate when it came to experiences relating to income and also precarity and the reality of not being able to get new opportunities in terms of, lectureship, tenure, but to a large extent, I can say that I did not make any postdoc friends that I still have today. Can be like, oh yeah, these are my friends, friends, friends. Managed to continue networking with a few, maybe like three, but in a very like loosely connected way, in the sense that we are not doing any intellectual work together. All right, so I think those are the key points I wanted to raise. I don't look particularly happy talking about postdoc because I think I'm still a bit traumatized by the whole experience, realizing how temporary you are. And one challenge I particularly experienced was, for example, that I had a visa or permit, whatever language you want to use, for the University of Cape Town. And then when I had to go to Stellenbosch University, I applied for a change of institution. I think I used a change of status application. And then my Stellenbosch visa was delayed. It only came out 6 months later. So fair enough, I could stay in South Africa because I had a valid visa. But Stellenbosch University only, admitted me on a temporary basis based on the visa receipt I had, but they could not pay out my funds until my visa was ready. If I can tell you, the first 6 months of that postdoc were extremely painful because I was not paid, but still going to campus. I was not paid, still going to participate in seminars and preparing for conference work and all of that. And fair enough, the money came when I got my visa around June, but really, like, if I didn't have any savings, I wouldn't have survived. So I don't know what that means for someone who wants to go into a postdoc and does not have immediately accessible funds or disposable income. So that's another challenge I think I encountered. And I think it's important to note this so that when you're applying for a study visa and it's being delayed, or rather a research visitor's visa and it's being delayed, these are some of the challenges you'd have to anticipate: that initial loss of income. Otherwise, please make sure that if you want to do a postdoc, you do thorough research on what they require from you and what would work best for the job you want to pursue in the future. I do not think that I had that in mind at the stage that I did my postdoc. Yes, I knew I wanted to be an academic, but I don't think I had a strategy. And I'm thinking of myself even starting an initiative whereby I provide mentorship or coaching to people who are in the PhD trenches or people who are postdocing, so that, of course, you've got a softer landing compared to the one that I probably had. Otherwise, it is goodbye for now. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. Feel free to comment, like, share for wider reach, and of course, subscribe if you've not done so yet. Thank you once again. It's goodbye for now.